The night my son-in-law put his hands on my shoulders and shoved me backward into the kitchen counter at my own wife's funeral reception was the night I stopped being a grieving widower and became something else entirely. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. My name is Ronald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Columbus, Ohio, and I retired with a clean record, a modest pension, a house that's been paid off since 2019, and one daughter, my Eleanor, who I would have walked through fire for without a second thought. Eleanor is 33. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh, and, God help her mother's habit of seeing the best in people long after the evidence says she should stop. My wife Margaret, God rest her, used to call it a gift. I called it a vulnerability. Turns out we were both right. Eleanor met her husband, Derek, at a work conference in Cincinnati about 4 years ago. He was charming the way a magician is charming. You're impressed right up until you figure out how the trick works, and then you feel foolish for clapping. He wore good shoes, said the right things, laughed at the right moments. He worked in sales, which I now understand is less a profession and more a personality disorder with a commission structure. I tried to like him. Margaret liked him, or at least she said she did, and Margaret was a better judge of character than me in most situations. She said he had energy. I said energy wasn't the same as substance. We agreed to disagree, which was something Margaret and I had 40 years of practice doing. Eleanor and Derek married in the fall of 2022. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's property outside of Dublin, Ohio. I walked my daughter down a gravel path between rows of white folding chairs, and I handed her to a man I wasn't sure about, and I smiled the whole time, because that's what fathers do. The first year was fine. The second year, Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor used words like aggressive and timeline and comfort measures, and the world went quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end. 8 months of hospitals and home nurses, and the particular silence that settles over a house when someone is leaving it slowly. Eleanor came home to help. Derek came with her, which I was grateful for at the time. They stayed in the guest room on the second floor. I thought having them there would help Eleanor, and it did, at first. What I didn't notice, because I was watching my wife of 40 years fade room by room, was that Derek had changed. Or maybe he hadn't changed. Maybe I just hadn't been paying attention before. He'd lost his job in January of that year. He told Eleanor it was downsizing, told me the same story when I asked once, carefully. It didn't seem like the right time to push. Margaret was the priority. Everything else could wait. But things I would have caught in normal circumstances slipped past me. The way Derek would disappear for hours and come back vague about where he'd been. The way he'd taken over managing their joint finances and Eleanor didn't seem to know the details. The way he'd started drinking more, not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say, there it is, but steadily, consistently, like a man maintaining a habit rather than enjoying a pleasure. Margaret passed on a Thursday morning in March. She went quietly, which was both a mercy and, in some ways, the cruelest part. I'd been holding her hand for 2 hours, and then I wasn't holding her hand anymore. I was just a man sitting beside a bed. The funeral was the following Monday. Eleanor handled most of the arrangements because she knew I couldn't. We had the service at Street, Andrews, where Margaret and I had attended for 22 years, and then we had people back to the house afterward, neighbors, Margaret's sister from Dayton, friends from the school where Margaret had taught 4th grade for 18 years. About 60 people moving through my living room and dining room with plates of food and gentle voices. I was standing by the window in the front room, talking to Margaret's old colleague Ruth, when I felt it. 2 hands on my shoulders, not gentle, not comforting, gripping, and then a push, not hard enough to knock me over, but hard enough that I stumbled, hard enough that Ruth's eyes went wide, hard enough that I had to grab the windowsill. I turned around. Derek was standing there with a glass of bourbon in his hand, the good bourbon, the bottle I'd received as a gift and kept on the high shelf, and his face had that particular blankness that comes not from calm, but from too much alcohol meeting, too much entitlement in the same body. "You've been ignoring me all day," he said, not quietly. Ruth had gone very still beside me. Today is not the day, I said. My voice was steady. I remember being surprised by that. You never thought I was good enough, he said. Margaret knew it. Eleanor knows it. You've been looking through me for 2 years. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I made a decision in that moment that I didn't fully understand yet. I decided not to react. Not because I was afraid, and not because I thought he deserved patience, but because something in me went very cold and very clear, and I understood that whatever I did in the next 30 seconds would either end this properly or just postpone it. Go upstairs, I said. Sleep it off. He stared at me for a long moment. Then Eleanor appeared at his elbow. She'd seen, or heard, or someone had gotten her, and she put her hand on his arm and steered him toward the stairs, and the whole thing was over in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't over, not even close. That night, after the last guest had left and the dishes were done and the house was the quietest it had ever been, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I thought about what had just happened. A man had put his hands on me at my wife's funeral, on the day I buried Margaret, in the house she and I had lived in for 27 years. I didn't sleep. In the morning, Eleanor came downstairs early and found me at the table. She looked like she hadn't slept either. She sat across from me and said, "Dad, I'm so sorry about yesterday. He's been under a lot of stress. He didn't mean—" "Eleanor," I said. "Stop." She stopped. "I'm not going to talk about Derek today. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer." She nodded. "Are you okay?" She looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked down at the table, and she said, "I don't know." That was all I needed to hear. Not because it told me everything, but because it told me she wasn't going to pretend anymore. At least not right that second. And that was a starting point. I told her I loved her. I told her this was her home as much as it had always been, and that I wasn't going anywhere. I did not tell her what I was already thinking. I did not tell her that I'd made a decision at that kitchen table in the dark, somewhere around 3 in the morning. I was going to find out exactly what Derek had been doing. All of it. And then I was going to act accordingly. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I'm not a vengeful person by nature. I spent my career writing specifications for drainage systems and load-bearing calculations. I coached youth soccer for 11 years. I am, or I was, a fairly straightforward man who believed in being fair and expecting fairness in return. But I was also a man who had just buried his wife, and something about grief, real grief, the kind that restructures you from the inside, has a clarifying effect. I had no patience left for nonsense. I had no interest in managing Derek's feelings or giving him the benefit of the doubt or waiting to see if things improved on their own. I had time. I had clarity. And I had 31 years of experience dealing with contractors who tried to cut corners and thought no one was keeping track. I started paying attention. Derek and Eleanor stayed at the house for another 3 weeks after the funeral, which gave me time to observe without being obvious about it. I watched Derek's schedule, the late mornings, the long absences in the afternoon, the evenings when he'd sit in the den with the door half closed and speak on the phone in a voice too low to hear. I watched Eleanor manage around him, anticipate his moods, quietly adjust the temperature of every room based on what she read in his face. I recognized it because Margaret had described it to me once, years ago, talking about a neighbor going through a difficult marriage. She called it walking on eggshells. She said you could always tell when someone was doing it because they moved differently, lighter, faster, constantly ready to change direction. Eleanor moved like that. I called my brother-in-law, Margaret's younger brother, Thomas, who works as a financial advisor in Cleveland. I told him what I'd observed Derek out of work, vague about finances, Eleanor uncertain. Thomas asked me a few careful questions and then said, "Ron, you should look at their accounts if you can." Not to pry. To know. Eleanor wouldn't show me that. You might not need Eleanor, he said. What Thomas meant was this. Margaret and Eleanor had a joint savings account that had been set up when Eleanor was in college. Margaret had put money in periodically over the years, birthday money, Christmas, small amounts whenever she felt like it. By the time Margaret passed, there was about $31,000 in that account. It was listed in Margaret's estate. As executor of Margaret's estate, I had the legal standing to review accounts associated with it. My attorney, a straightforward man named Carl, who I've known since Eleanor was in middle school, confirmed this. He also told me to brace myself. The account had $4,200 in it. Between November, 2 months after Derek lost his job in March, someone had made 11 withdrawals from that account, totaling just over $26,000. The withdrawals were made from ATMs in Columbus, Dublin, and twice from a location in Indiana I didn't recognize. Eleanor's name was on the account. Derek was not. But Eleanor Carl told me carefully, had given Derek a linked debit card 3 years ago, early in their marriage, as a convenience. She had apparently forgotten about it, or assumed it was unused. Derek had not forgotten about it. I sat in Carl's office and looked at the transaction record, and I thought about what $26,000 means to a retired engineer on a pension. I thought about what it meant to Margaret, who had built that account $20 at a time over 15 years. I thought about what it meant that Derek had been draining it while Eleanor and I sat at Margaret's bedside at OSU Wexner Medical Center. Then I set the paper down and I asked Carl what my options were. He walked me through them methodically. Depending on the circumstances, what Derek had done might rise to the level of criminal theft or financial fraud. Eleanor's consent to share the card did not necessarily constitute consent to drain an estate account, particularly funds that were about to pass to a beneficiary. There were also civil avenues, and then there were the personal decisions that weren't legal at all, just human. "What do you want to accomplish?" Carl asked me. I told him I wanted 3 things. I wanted Derek out of Eleanor's life. I wanted Eleanor to understand clearly and completely what had been done to her. And I wanted to make sure that whatever happened next, Eleanor had somewhere safe to land. Carl nodded and said, "Then let's be patient, and let's be thorough." I told no one else. Not Thomas, not Ruth, not any of the neighbors who called to check on me in the weeks after the funeral. I went about my days, walked the neighborhood in the mornings, kept the house, had dinner ready when Eleanor came downstairs. I was present and calm, and I gave Derek no reason to think I was anything other than a grieving old man who had accepted that his daughter had made her choices. Patience is a skill like any other. You practice it until it's second nature. What I didn't expect was Eleanor coming to me first. It was a Saturday morning, about 6 weeks after the funeral. Derek had gone out ostensibly to meet a friend about a possible job lead, which I had started to understand was a fiction he used to account for time he didn't want to explain. Eleanor and I were in the kitchen. She was making coffee. I was reading the paper. She put the mug down in front of me and she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I looked up. "I think Derek has a problem," she said. "Not just the drinking. Something else. He keeps getting calls at strange hours and he won't tell me who it is. And last week I found a number I didn't recognize in his phone. And when I called it back from a different number, it was a casino in Indiana." She said, "The last part, the way you say something you've been holding in your chest for too long all at once, before you can think better of it." I put the paper down. "How long have you been carrying this?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Months. I didn't want to. I mean, with Mom, I couldn't put this on top of Mom. I couldn't." She stopped, pressed her fingers to her eyes. "I feel like such an idiot." "You are not an idiot," I said. "You are someone who was trying to hold too many things at once, and you held them as long as you could. That's not stupidity. That's loyalty that wasn't deserved." She cried for a while. I let her. Then I got her a box of tissues and refilled her coffee, and I told her that I had something to show her. I showed her the transaction record. I watched my daughter's face as she read it. I watched her go through disbelief and then recognition, and then something that wasn't quite grief but was adjacent to it. That particular devastation of realizing someone you trusted made a choice about you that you didn't know had been made. She went through it slowly, like reading a document in a language she understood but had hoped to never use. When she got to the end, she set the papers on the table and she looked at me. "He took Mom's money," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "While she was dying?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "What do we do?" And this is the moment I'd been patient for. Not to give an order, not to say I told you so, not to make her feel worse than she already did, but to offer her something concrete and real when she was finally ready to reach for it. "Carl has been advising me," I said. "We have options. But the first step is yours, not mine." I can help you with everything that comes after. But the decision has to be yours." She nodded. She looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden Margaret had planted, and that I'd been keeping up badly because I didn't really know how. And then she turned back and she said, "I want out." 2 words. But they held everything. Over the next 3 weeks, Carl worked with a family law attorney he trusted, a woman named Diane who had the manner of someone who had heard everything and remained unshocked by all of it. Diane advised Eleanor on the divorce proceedings. Carl coordinated with a forensic accountant to document the withdrawals formally. We established that Eleanor had not knowingly authorized the withdrawals from the estate account, which is a meaningful legal distinction. Derek was served at a Panera Bread in Dublin on a Tuesday afternoon. I know this because Carl told me, and because I may have driven past the parking lot while it was happening. Not to gloat, just because there are some moments you need to be close to, even if you're not in them. Derek's initial response was anger. He called Eleanor 14 times in 2 hours. She didn't answer. He showed up at the house that evening, my house, the house where he had put his hands on me 4 weeks earlier, and he stood on the front porch and rang the bell until I opened the door. "I need to talk to Eleanor," he said. "Eleanor is not available," I said. "You can't keep her from me. She's my wife." "For now," I said, "but you'll want to speak with your attorney rather than with me. That's the appropriate channel at this point." He stared at me. He was trying to find the version of me he'd managed before the quiet, unresponsive grief dad, who could be ignored or shoved, and would simply absorb it. That version wasn't standing in the doorway. "You did this," he said. "You did this," I said. I just made sure it was documented. I closed the door. Not dramatically, just closed it. He left. He didn't come back. The divorce took 4 months. Eleanor moved into the guest room officially, and I converted the den into something more comfortable for her new paint. The reading chair she'd always liked, the desk from her old bedroom that had been in storage. I was not rebuilding my daughter's childhood bedroom. I was building something forward-facing, somewhere she could figure out what came next without anyone making her feel small while she figured it out. During those 4 months, Derek's attorney attempted to argue that the joint account withdrawals were authorized, that Eleanor had given him carte blanche access. The forensic accountant's documentation made this difficult to sustain. More damaging was a discovery. Carl's contact at the casino confirmed Derek had been a regular at their facilities for approximately 18 months, with documented visits totaling more than 40 occasions. The math was not kind to the financial stress narrative his attorney was constructing. I'll be honest with you. There was a version of this where I pushed for criminal charges. Carl said we had a reasonable case. But Eleanor asked me not to, and I thought about it for a week, genuinely thought about it, not just deferred to her, and I decided she was right. Criminal proceedings would have taken longer, cost more emotionally, and kept Derek in our lives in a way that would have hurt her more than him. The goal was not punishment. The goal was freedom. There was one other thing, which I want to tell you about because it matters to me that it's understood correctly. Margaret had a life insurance policy, not a large one, $85,000, which is what we could afford when we took it out and never adjusted. I was the primary beneficiary. I had originally planned to leave it alone, put it in savings, maybe use some of it for the house. Instead, I set aside $40,000 in a separate account in Eleanor's name only. No linked cards, no joint access. Just Eleanor's name and Eleanor's information and a letter I wrote explaining that it was from her mother that Margaret had spent 18 years putting $20 here and $50 there into that joint account, and that this was the closest I could get to giving that money back, with interest, from the woman who'd saved it. I dropped the letter in the mail to Eleanor, even though she was living 30 feet away, because some things should be handed over formally. Some things should have weight. She knocked on my bedroom door that evening with the letter in her hand, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, this is too much." "It's not from me," I said. "It's from your mother." She sat on the edge of the bed I'd shared with Margaret for 40 years, and she cried, the kind of cry that's also relief, the kind that means something has finally loosened. I sat next to her and put my arm around her, and we stayed like that for a while, in the room where her mother had slept. Some things I want to say plainly, because I've told this to a few people and I've heard different reactions. Some people think I should have acted faster, that the night Derek shoved me, I should have called the police immediately, had him removed, pressed assault charges on the spot. And I want to be honest. I understand that instinct. What he did was wrong. It was a crime, technically. He put his hands on me at my wife's funeral. But I also knew that if I had done that in the heat of that moment with 60 people in my house, with Eleanor watching, with everyone still raw from Margaret's service, it would have become about that incident. Derek would have managed the narrative. He was good at that. And Eleanor wasn't ready. She was still in the part of the story where she was trying to convince herself it wasn't as bad as it was. The 6 weeks I waited were not 6 weeks of doing nothing. They were 6 weeks of building something solid enough that when the truth landed, it would be undeniable. When you're dealing with someone who is skilled at manipulation, at reframing, at making victims question their own perceptions, you don't beat them with speed. You beat them with documentation. I also want to say something about Eleanor, because I know some people hear this kind of story and want to be hard on the person who stayed, who made excuses, who looked the other way. I've heard it. I've read it, even in comments on things like this. People who say she should have known sooner, should have acted faster, should have chosen differently. Eleanor is not stupid. Eleanor was doing what people do when they love someone who is slowly dismantling that love. She was filling in the gaps with hope, explaining away the evidence, carrying the weight of the relationship because she thought if she carried enough of it, the relationship would survive. That's not weakness. That's what sustained love looks like when it's being exploited. And the moment she had enough solid ground to stand on, the moment I could show her something real and documented rather than just my intuition and my dislike of her husband, she acted. She filed. She moved forward. She did the hard thing. I've watched her over these past several months rebuild something. She went back to work full-time. She's reconnected with friends she'd let drift. She laughs at the dinner table now, a real laugh, not the careful version she'd been using for 2 years. Last month, she planted something in Margaret's garden. I don't know what it is. She said it's a surprise. I told her that was fine. The house is different with her here. Quieter than it was when Margaret was alive, but not the hollow quiet I had in the weeks after. More like the quiet of a place that has settled into itself. Derek is living somewhere in the Columbus area. I don't know exactly where, and I don't particularly need to. The divorce was finalized. The financial matter was resolved as part of the settlement, not a full recovery, but enough that Eleanor knows what was taken and has some acknowledgement of it. He has not contacted either of us. I'm 64 years old and I'm a widower. And my daughter is living in my house and we have dinner together most evenings. And sometimes we watch bad television. And sometimes we just sit in the same room reading different things. I am not going to pretend this is what I imagined. Margaret and I had plans for this phase of life, plans that included her. But I've learned that the plans you lose and the life you actually have don't have to be in opposition. You can grieve one and tend to the other at the same time. Margaret taught me that, actually, though she didn't know she was teaching it. She tended to things. She planted $20 at a time. She built things slowly and with her hands. And she trusted that they'd be there when they were needed. I think about her every morning. I think about the 40 years I had with her, and I think about the fact that her last 8 months were spent in a house that also contained a man who was quietly stealing from her. That part still makes me angry. I expect it always will. But I also think about Eleanor at the kitchen table, looking out at the backyard, saying I want out, and I think about what it took for her to get to that sentence. I think about the letter I mailed 30 feet down the hall. I think about whatever is growing in Margaret's garden that I'm not supposed to ask about. And I think we're going to be okay. Maybe not the okay we planned for, but okay. One more thing, and then I'll let you go. The night Derek shoved me the night of Margaret's funeral, with 60 people in my house, and a glass of my good bourbon in his hand, there was a moment, just after Eleanor had taken him upstairs, when Ruth was still standing next to me by the window. She put her hand on my arm and said, "Ronald, are you all right?" I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way Margaret used to look at me when she thought I was saying one thing and feeling another. "You don't have to be fine," she said. "I know that. I knew it then. I wasn't fine. I was 63 years old and I'd buried my wife that morning and a man had pushed me in my own living room and my daughter hadn't said a word. But I also knew standing there by that window in the house I'd paid off, with a pension I'd earned, and a lawyer I trusted, and 31 years of knowing how to build things that hold, that I had what I needed. Not to get even, to make it right. There's a difference. It took me a long time to understand the difference, but Margaret helped me with that too. I'm going to go check on whatever's growing in the garden.